You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For over 40 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan White.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. Today's topic is wedding photography. You know, it's getting to that time of year again, even though it's 41 degrees this morning. It is May and people are getting ready to get married. This happens this time of year. Today, John Harris and I will be chatting with Jide Alakija. But first, we have a question for you. Are you a subscriber to our show yet? If not, head over to iTunes and sign on. It is free. And not only will you have a front row seat to every new show that we have coming up, but you're going to also have full access to every podcast we've recorded going back to 1936 when we covered the Hindenburg disaster. You all remember that. Oh, the humanity! I think I was at my best there. But...
I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, before we kick in our conversation with Jide, this week's Gearhead Pick of the Week is a shout-out to none other than the man with the best nickname in the business, Mike Sharky James, who twice a week fills us in on the latest photographic news, reviews, and opinions of photography. Sharky delivers intelligent information brought to you with insight and something I take quite seriously, a touch of humor. John sent him a brief introductory email early on, and he responded with open arms, offering advice, contacts, and friendship. And what more can you ask for? Check out the Petapixel Photography Podcast with Sharky James. Find it on the Petapixel website or wherever you find fine podcasts, and in tribute to Sharky.
Next.
Okay, anyway, let's get back to the business at hand. Our guest today is Jide Alakija. He is a Brooklyn-based but internationally renowned wedding documentary and editorial photographer. And you are from Great Britain, correct?
I am indeed.
Okay, you could tell by that accent. Okay. Nice break from all the Brooklyn we have around here. Amongst countless assignments to weddings, he's photographed Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, hip-hop artist J. Cole, and for you soccer fans out there, he's done portraits of Didier Drogba. Jide is also the co-owner of Tafeta. Is that the way it's pronounced?
Tafeta.
Tafeta, T-A-F-E-T-A, a private art dealership based in London that specializes in 20th century and contemporary African art. His work outside the wedding sphere has garnered much attention also, and his photos are included in important private and public collections, including the Smithsonian Institute. As a wedding photographer, his documentary style is imbued with humor and passion, and as he says, we love to tell stories plain and simple. He's been invited to photograph weddings around the world, and the list of countries is far too long to list here. Keen to share his extensive expertise, Jide has been a featured speaker at photo festivals and conferences. He currently hosts personal photography workshops and runs various mentoring programs in West Africa for underprivileged photography students. Welcome, Jide. Pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Alan. How are you?
Wonderful.
Perfect.
What got you into photography, and how did you get into wedding photography?
Let's see now. 13 years ago, whilst I was in university in London, a couple of my friends and I actually got together to set up a website. This is before the advent of Facebook. We thought it would be good to have a social media platform. I mean, then we didn't think it was a social media platform, but we thought it would be good to have a media platform for hobbyists to share their photos. One of the things that I was particularly interested in was actually populating the site with my own photographs. They bought cameras, and I bought a camera with them, and found myself really interested in sharing my photographs.
So you were already involved in photography at this point, or you're just starting to?
I was a programmer. I was writing code. I was writing a PhD thesis, which required me to write some programs for the actual thesis. You know, it was the advent of the .com boom, and we wanted to catch that bubble, maybe create something that was going to explode, just like Amazon did. Everything was kind of coming out of different people's garages, and overnight they became millionaires. So we thought, you know, we're quite clever people.
Why not
right?
us, right?
Yeah. There we
That's
are.
our story. We just do this just past time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I see that Rolex watch that you have.
But you didn't notice the two L's in Rolex, did you?
That's true, actually. It was like two C's making an X. But anyway, yeah, it was, that kind of was kind of the foundation to actually what got me into photography. We actually did set up a platform. It was a photo blogging platform where we were sharing photographs very much like Instagram is today. But it was before mobile technology kicked off. It was interesting when I remember when Instagram actually blew up and was sold to Facebook. I called one of my friends and said, "Hey, dude, did you just read the news?" They're like, "Yeah, man, they sold pretty much what we actually created." It's like if we'd stuck to it, we probably would have been in the same position. But the point is, we kept on with this platform and found that it was gaining a lot of traction from photographers around the world. I was carrying on the momentum in my own community, putting photos in there whilst I was writing my PhD thesis. And, you know, it pretty much was the thing that I was doing to kind of keep me in the social sphere. When you're writing a thesis, you find yourself very alone, very isolated, not really, mixing with a lot of people. And it could be, like I said, really dull. And I needed something to kind of get me connected to the world. And then following in from that, I ran out of funding.
As you do. That happens.
Right.
When that happens.
And then I had to find a way to make some money. I think this was 3 years into my photography hobby, if you want to call it. Weddings just seemed like the thing to do. I didn't actually like it at the time. I found it really strange how you'd want to attempt to take artistic photos of people that they didn't actually want. They just wanted the most basic photographs of themselves looking pretty. So anyway,
it's funny how people have this. No, this doesn't look like a wedding photograph.
Right.
It has to be stiff.
It has to be. Yeah, it has to. They come to you because they love how your photos look, but then they want something completely different. Yeah, totally different from what it is.
Right.
So that really frustrated me. I went in and I was like, look, I'll give you what you want. And then I found that people were still coming to me to do wedding photos, even though they were looking at my non-wedding portfolio. And then they would show the wedding photos I took, and people would go, I don't believe he took that, because this is what his work actually looks like. This does not look like his actual work. So other people came up to me and said, you've got to do something about this. You got to make your wedding photos look like what you're doing, or you just have to stop the other stuff that you're doing and just focus on the weddings and just stop confusing people. So for the last sort of 7-8 years after that, I was in this dilemma as to how to present my work, either as a wedding photographer or as a street photographer or a landscape photographer, whatever you wanted to call it. And that sort of went on. And I think until when I moved to the US and started to really take learning how to take proper like artistic photos and make it look like how my clients wanted it to be.
Blending the two.
The two of them, yeah, exactly. Then I started to see how the two sort of came together and I think that's kind of been my journey. It's bringing my vision for how I want my photos to look and how my commercial photos have been sort of portrayed, bringing them together into one vision, and also my own voice.
You want to make it yours.
Right, exactly. And it's also saying, this is how I want you to look. Even though I know you have the perspective of seeing things this way. It's also helped now that, you have more photographs being shared through social media, through all the different platforms out there. People are really expressing themselves more creatively.
Now, when you started I'm assuming in London, right?
Yeah.
The wedding work, was there a group of people or a community that you work with specifically? Who was coming to you for work? How did you start to network and your client base grow?
It actually all started by going to parties with my camera and taking photographs of just people randomly, because again, I found those parties boring and there was just not much to do, but then I felt accepted with a camera. And so I actually started getting invited to come to parties with the camera. But not because people, first of all, no one could afford the camera that I had and no one really cared about it so much, but they loved the way they looked in the photos. And then also, I was putting their photos online on my website because I was looking for traffic to bring to the other stuff that I was doing. Even so much so that, again, in those days, you didn't have huge bandwidths. So I would repeatedly get emails from the hosting company telling me, you need to cut down the amount of data that you're bringing our servers down. You've got to do something. Otherwise, we're going to have to, cut it down. So it was really funny because now I think about it today, because we don't complain about those things like we do. But then it was a real big issue. But through that, people loved the idea of being photographed candidly. They loved how they looked in the photos, and then they asked questions like, do you do weddings? Because we didn't have social media, people didn't know anything about photography, they didn't know who to call, and the only person they could think of was me. So they asked me if I did it, and I was like, yeah, sure. And that's actually how I started to do weddings in different parts of the world.
Just by showing up with the camera and
showing up in the camera in a nightclub and just putting it out there. And it was like a really good means of advertising. And also, I think the thing that is very easy to take for granted is the fact that I also had the knowledge of, or the tools to put the stuff in a public space.
Yes.
Which a lot of photographers didn't have at the time. There wasn't... to be a photographer, you were the guy who operated the darkroom, or you just used Photoshop a few times. We didn't have Lightroom. I think we used Capture One at the time. And then, here was this guy who knows how to write web pages, and then he's coming with these photos, and he puts these galleries, which he's created in, I think it was in Photoshop or something. I can't remember. There was some way you could create these galleries, and people were just clicking through, and they were loving them. Of course, the hosting companies didn't like it at all, because it was just like, you're bringing the thing down, even though it's not on our terms, what you can't put up there. For me, it was like, oh, but you said I have unlimited space.
They didn't think you'd ever take them up on it.
They didn't think that, exactly. So, and they didn't have a solution either, because I said, okay, so what would I do? It's like, oh, you've got to buy your own dedicated server. How much is that? That's like thousands of pounds. And I'm like, I don't have I don't have that kind of money. So it was something that became a real big issue.
So on your website, you say that you shoot multicultural weddings. I mean,
right.
And obviously you travel the world. Do you specifically market yourself as a multicultural wedding photographer? Or is there such a thing? And why do you keep that on your website? And tell us a bit about like your client base and
I think that's more to do with SEO than anything else. I would photograph anybody's wedding, because multicultural really is a relative word.
Yeah.
It means if you call me up, I'll photograph your wedding.
Right, exactly.
That's really, really. If you boil it down, that's...
Of course, there you go.
If you have a culture.
If you've got a culture, exactly. So, but I think it's also a buzzword as well. Certain people like to be put in certain categories. And I just was looking for something that didn't say I photographed this particular genre. I wanted something that made people feel unique for who they were. So as an Englishman over here, you would have people who are English, and they would say, well, I don't feel American. I feel like I'm I've some other culture. And then I'm looking for someone who can photograph something of a mixed culture, especially if they're marrying someone who was American. So you have the American culture with the British culture. And so the idea is, it's supposed to kind of be a blanket over different cultures. And so people actively Google multicultural weddings. And that's really what that's all about.
How much homework do you do before, like somebody calls you up and it's, again, you're familiar with Americans for the most part and people from England and stuff.
Yeah.
But somebody calls you up and they're from a whole other genre of humanity. What kind of homework do you do about that? How do you handle that?
Okay, well, I can give you an example. So I had an inquiry from someone from Namibia. And she says, oh, I want you to photograph my wedding. It's a 2-day ceremony. Just give me a quote. And I'm thinking, I've done this before. I know not done the wedding, but I had an inquiry before and say, yeah, I'll just give you a random quote. And then they just disappear. Or they say, oh, yeah, great, we want that. And then you realize that, oh, shit, you've quoted for the wrong thing because you've not fully understood what it is that they want. So what I generally tend to do is kind of have a series of conversations with them just to get a good picture. Sometimes it also helps to speak to people or friends who are also from their region. And I have a whole ton of friends from different parts of the world that I would say, hey, I got an inquiry from someone from probably where you're from, and they said they have about 800 people at the wedding. So how are we, like, how does this actually work? Can you give me an idea of what they're expecting? Not just also from the perspective of, okay, they want me to shoot the wedding, but how much are people spending on wedding photographers, so I get a good, perspective on, how my fees
Their
will be.
expectations, right?
Right,
Yeah,
what the
yeah,
expectations are and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes if I haven't got that kind of link, just put it on Facebook. Just put something out there, or just go on Twitter. Hey guys, I'm interested in doing this sort of thing. Some community responds and says, oh, actually, I know someone who's done that sort of thing. Why don't you speak to them? Or, oh, I photographed a wedding in China before. This is how it actually goes. Always make sure you take this with you. It's so easy to forget that, you need to have a voice-activated light stand, for instance, now, or something like that, or make sure you have a lot of water, because you're not going to stop. So, for instance, now, say you're shooting an Indian wedding, which goes on for like so many hours. For a lot of us who shoot just weddings that are about 8, 9, 10 hours, it could be quite daunting for us. And the expectations are set in such a way that you should be on your feet for that long. I shot weddings where you're not expected to be fed by the actual wedding party. You've got to bring your own food. And yeah, exactly. It's all very different. Or I had a client, a friend who made a request to shoot a wedding in Nigeria, and he contacted me and said, "Oh, you're Nigerian. I've heard they have weddings of about 5,000 people." I'm like, "Yeah, they do have weddings of 5,000 people." He's like, "How do you shoot 5,000 people wedding?" I'm like,
2 speed lights.
right, just 2 speed lights should take you through.
One won't do it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just little things like that. So I think the information is, as I said, is key in terms of...
How do you shoot a wedding of 5,000 people?
I mean, in my own experience, shooting such weddings you can't sort of see everything through the same keyhole. Because you shoot, say, a 30 or 80 person wedding, it's a different expectation when you're hired to shoot, say, a 5,000 person wedding.
But even the cultural aspects of it, though, say it's a culture that you're not familiar with, there are all kinds of customs and do's and don'ts that every group and nationality
like photographing the rest of the family,
the whole thing. So
kind of stuff.
how do you prepare for that?
Yeah.
I mean, do you ever say, okay, I don't know anything about this group of people?
I'll tell you the best one. I had to shoot a wedding where I couldn't understand a word of anything anybody was saying, because it was all in a language that was so foreign to me. And it can be very daunting, but there are certain things that, obviously, I was briefed beforehand by the couple that these are the key things that are important. But one thing they did stress was they wanted me to photograph them the way I photograph all my other weddings. And of course, you do need that information to do it properly. But there were certain things that did stand out. Certain reactions are universal. People laugh the same way. They no matter whether it's whatever the joke is or whatever is being said. Of course, it helps if you can hear what's being said, but it did offer a different challenge. What I found now is it's a good idea to work or take someone who is familiar with that culture to just do the safe thing for you, and then you just go out there with your eye and just pick out the things that are important to you. So,
and you normally work with assistants?
I always work with another photographer,
okay.
And sometimes I have an assistant who's usually somebody who's learning photography or somebody who has an interest in photography. Such a person would carry bags. Right. If anything, if I'm in a country where I don't understand the language, I would have that person be someone local who can translate, because it's happened before where I've been in France, photographed. I had a bride and groom one was English, the bride is English, the groom was French. So his whole family was French, and the bride's family was all English. And my assistant actually was a translator for the wedding, because they didn't think to have a translator.
That's funny.
It was so strange. So what ended up happening was the planner was like, I don't understand anything that's being said here. And so my assistant ended up doing translation throughout. And I was like, I'm hiring this person to work for me, and you're now using this person to do everything else for you. And they got slightly overwhelmed, but
Did the bride and groom at least speak the same language?
Oh yeah,
they understood each other.
They
Okay,
understood
all right.
each other.
That's what counts.
Yeah, exactly. But
So we want to talk a little bit about the traveling aspect of being a wedding photographer and,
Right.
and that aspect. So maybe we can start with a simple thing. What's the gear you normally use, and what do you bring when you're traveling? I mean,
Right.
what adjustments do you make? Do you bring less stuff?
Right.
How's that work for you?
yeah, the key thing about traveling is traveling light.
Yeah.
Yes.
But traveling with enough stuff to help you get the job done. So I now travel with 3 cameras. One offers a backup to the other 2. So I use a Nikon D750 as I have 2 of those that I take with me. And I have the new Fujifilm X-D2 that I just carry around. I mean, that's usually a 3rd camera, but that I carry around too. But it is the backup camera. Because again, when you get to your location, different things can happen to your cameras, and that can't be an excuse for that. Then I have certain range of lenses that I take. I normally work with 24mm, a 35mm, a 50 or an 85mm. So normally I'll take, if not all 4 of those, sometimes I'll take just 3 of those, which would just be the 35, 24, and the 85. If I'm going to a very conservative space or location where you can't move around in the church as much, or you can't move around in the space, or people are very wary of you getting too close, I would have a 135 f2 lens with me.
And how do you know about that ahead of time? I mean, is it something you get from talking to the bride and groom,
Exactly,
or knowing
just-
the culture?
Just from the culture, knowing the people, doing some research. After a while, you just know who to speak to. You get an inquiry from a very, very different place from where you've been to. You just ask more questions, how people are, what it's like for photographers to go around.
And what about learning the spaces that you're going to be going to, especially if it's in a new country? Or do you ask for that information? Do you go to the websites of the hall or whatnot?
Yeah, I try to ask for as much information as possible. Sometimes, especially if you're shooting in a third world country, where you're shooting doesn't have a website.
Yeah.
You don't have any photos of that space. If you can get there early or a day before, it helps, because then you get to see the space. Sometimes I want to meet the minister or meet the person who will tell you much of what's going on.
The caterer.
The caterers, you'd be surprised actually.
They run the show.
Waiters, caterers, they tell
Yeah.
you. I'll tell you a funny story actually. So I was shooting a wedding in Nigeria. Now, because their weddings are huge, they have, you need to sort of put a certain sense of order. And the way they do that is they have bouncers. They have like bouncers you have in nightclubs, they have them at the weddings. And the bouncers generally tend to control everyone, literally, including the photographer. So where you step or where you point your camera, they're not having it. So what I found is, because they have, let's say, 30 different photographers all going for the same shot. All hired photographers all going for the same shot. Because the wedding's so huge, what happens is you get different family members offering photography as a gift to the couple or to the family. And they all do the same thing because it's pretty cheap for them. And so what ends up happening is photographers are all fighting. It's like press photographers,
press scrum,
and they call them paparazzis in the end. No, literally, guests always say, "Oh, the paparazzis are here. The paparazzis are here." They actually literally say that. So you find yourself struggling with these people because they're always in your compositions.
Oh, yeah.
So what I found works for me now is I speak to the bouncers. I offer them a tip, usually worth about anything from $1 to $5. And I tell them, can you do me a big favor? At the end of the night, you're going to get a really big tip. Talk to all your guys. Anytime I need your assistance, I'm just going to put my hand up and I need you to just clear the area. The thing is,
I like this guy's style. I do.
and it works. And the thing is, because they feel, well, this guy's probably the only guy who's going to give me a tip tonight, because the big bosses are not going to give me a tip. I'm going to do whatever he wants. Of course, I'm going to keep the bosses happy, but he's one guy who's actually acknowledged everything I'm doing here. So every time I put my hands up or like, hey, I need your help, they're like, don't worry, man, I got you. They're going in and they're pushing like flies all these photographers out of the way. And they get to a point where the photographers are like, do you know what? this photographer seems to have some sort of magical power or some superpower where he's able to kind of use his mind to tell these guys to do certain things. I'm just going to stay away from him. And generally that's what always happens. So you just kind of find ways to kind of make these things work for you.
Yeah. Well, that's a great example of what we're talking about, just the kind of cultural
it's just really understanding, especially in a lot of third world countries, you find that you need to understand the currency of how things work. What actually makes people listen to you? Because otherwise...
How do you grease the machine?
Right, exactly. Things don't work the same way as they work here in the West. It's a completely different thing. The same thing with the ministers, with their ushers, everything. You have to find a way around it.
Let me jump back just real quick. You mentioned prime lenses. Is that all you bring? Do you use zooms too?
No, I don't use any zooms at all.
Okay.
The primes are a lot lighter. They're a lot more versatile too.
And lights? Do you bring lights with you? Or?
Oh yes. I would normally carry 3-speed lights. Normally I would just use 2, one on camera and one off camera. But there's always a backup. There's
speed lights are what are you using?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There generally is always a backup of everything because things can go wrong. If you're in a country where you don't have access to something as beautiful as B&H, you
need to have it. Yeah.
You don't have it.
You have to have everything in your bag.
You have to have everything in your bag somehow, and especially when things can go wrong.
What about
they will.
Yeah, of course.
Like charging and electricity. I mean, you always have to worry about currency.
I don't assume that I'm going to have electricity. Even if I do, I don't assume that it's going to be there. So I have like mobile hard drive that you can back up your cards in. I have I take a ton of batteries. Each time I travel, I take about 24 batteries, even though I'm only going to use about 4 or 5. I have a ton of cards, like memory cards that I take. Yeah, I think the key thing is making sure that you have enough stuff there. And then also my laptop also goes into my camera bag because there are times when you have to edit as you're shooting. I shot a wedding in Dubai for a celebrity once where they wanted photographs out as we were shooting at the same time because they knew it was going to get published and all that kind of stuff. And they didn't want the magazines picking up Instagram photos instead. So while shooting, I had sort of someone with my laptop editing and sort of putting cards, getting images out there and emailing it to different magazines.
I used to do a lot of yachting photography, and every once in a while I'd have to go down to Bermuda, and there was a little dance I had to go through, and I learned the first time I did this that I have to go down a day early because the first thing you do when you enter the country is they confiscate all your equipment and they say that you are taking work away from a local. And you have to go down to the customs agency the next day, with some cash in your hand and explain to them that the local guy only has a 28 millimeter lens and I have a 21, so I could do better interiors.
Right.
Oh, okay, fine. Give me the money and you can go.
Right.
So, but it was a routine that they would take away your equipment. You have to go pay a quote unquote tax to get it out. So I'd have to build a day into my trip just to make sure I have my gear. Do you find yourself dealing with the same stuff?
That has I've never had my gear confiscated off me. If I've had to, if anything, I've probably had someone's come up to me and tell me to delete a photo, like an official. Usually if I pay them some money or tip them something, they usually let me go. But I guess it's never been as bad. The worst I think that has ever happened is being at customs, at immigration, and having to justify that this equipment is mine and I'm not actually going to make money out of it and sell to anyone. My bag is really small.
I was going to ask you about that, but do you carry everything on the plane with you?
Yes.
That you're not checking anything, I'm assuming.
I don't check any valuable things.
Yeah.
Things like monopods or tripods I can put into my bag, but things I know I may not need, I can put in. So like a video light, for instance, and I carry a video light sometimes. I'll put that into my check luggage. But things that I know are really
your primary
essential,
gear that you can't survive without them. Okay.
Right, yeah. Because I've had bags, even here in the US, I've had bags not make it to my destination. So,
You had hinted earlier that you need to hire some people when you're there if there's a language or a cultural thing. But do you usually, when you get an assistant, get somebody from the place that you're shooting, or do you bring the person with you? And how do you bill for that? I mean, is everything, billed to the couple in terms of airfare and travel and hotels and things like that?
Right. So in terms of assistance, there are two different things. So there's the second shooter and there's the assistant.
Right.
So the second shooter is usually somebody I would bring with me. Not usually from New York. It could just be a friend who's somewhere. Could be someone from Mexico. I've got really good friends in Mexico. I've got friends in Europe. Depends on how close they are to the wedding and availability as well. And an assistant could be someone local, or it could be someone, if the budget allows, someone I could bring with me, someone I know who will do more than just assisting. In terms of billing, I would kind of put that into the price, because most clients would ask me about that. How much would it cost me to have you come to this place to shoot this wedding? And the question itself is not just how much is it for your shooting time, it's how much would it cost me in terms of your shooting, your hotel, your travel, and everything else that you need. So normally I would give them a rough estimate of a budget and say, hey, this is how much you should expect to spend. And in that, I would put everything in there. So travel, usually hotel, I would tell them, just book that for me, but everything else I would sort out. So at least they have an idea.
So you do your research, you check out airfare, and then give them a general ballpark. And at the end, do you itemize it, or that's just a flat fee?
No, it's usually just a flat fee. Itemizing it opens you up to a lot more negotiation, and for things where they ask questions like, well, why am I paying this much for your airfare? Why am I paying this much for that? Why do I need you to bring an assistant? You should probably have somebody local, can't you? And that could also affect the integrity of your work. So to just kind of remove all that uncertainty, I just kind of say, okay, this is how much it would cost you just for this.
Do you, let's say, juggle your prices based on knowledge of the country and, how much things might cost there, or do you try to kind of keep it level playing field?
Yeah, the prices are very standard because, again, a client could insist on that breakdown. And I don't try to change it too much. If, say, I'm working in a country where the client says, okay, I'm only going to need you for 9 hours, and I know they're going to need a lot more than 9 hours, so they're just being too conservative in their estimate, then I would bill them for 11 and then tell them that I put the extra in because of this particular reason. Now, if they're not happy with it, then I would say, well, do you know what? Let's just stick with it. And if there is an issue, I would give you a refund. Because more often than not, there is always a conservative estimate in that regard, because I've shot there before and I know what they're talking about. They're going to be late for the church, and it's not going to be their fault. It's going to be because there's so much trouble, traffic. The makeup artists are going to make it on time and all that kind of stuff.
Actually, that leads me to one of the questions I had about travel and destination is, how do you handle the fact that when you're at a location and maybe it's, I don't know, a resort or someplace like that, and everyone is there, do the people expect you to be there kind of 24/7 to catch every little moment because you're there too? Does that become a complicated thing where you have to say, listen, no, this is my work hours and the rest of the time I'm on my own, or if you want me, you have to pay a little more or stuff like that, Hey, we just decided we're going to go on a boat, come with us.
Okay, I can give you like two different scenarios. So usually the most ideal scenario is where you're booked into the same resort as everyone is, and everyone is all on site together.
Is that usually the case?
Most times that is the case.
Make the most sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
But not all destination weddings are on resorts. Sometimes they're in a city where you could be booked in a hotel, which is halfway across town, and sort of getting across may be difficult. But in the first situation, the expectation is I would have sort of prepared them and said, hey, this is the time I'm going to be shooting for you, which is usually the rehearsal dinner and also the wedding day. Those are the times you're expected to have your camera. However, I would carry, say, my little Fuji with me because I know they're going to see friends. They're going to get so excited at different moments, and stuff's going to happen, which I actually do like to capture because I think it makes a really, really interesting story to the whole thing. And it's
part of the narrative.
It's part of the narrative, exactly. And you also want to impress your client by saying, oh, don't worry, I'm here, But you're like, oh, but, we didn't pay for this. It's perfectly fine. I'm having a great time. I feel like I'm part of your wedding as opposed to your hired vendor. And that feeling that they get almost makes them feel like they can, do whatever. And
they could just let go and just go with the flow, and you're doing your job and you're on their side.
And which is usually how I want to work. Just kind of operating as a fly on the wall, being like that uninvited guest who's kind of around, just kind of mingling with people, and who has a license to get out whenever he feels like. So in such situations, it does work. Yeah. But in such situations, it's it's pretty cool when you have that, kind of coming in, and then you can leave when you feel like it because you're tired, or you're like, okay, do you know what? I'm going to go to bed now and prepare for tomorrow, or do whatever.
It's a good way of doing it because, first of all, I don't have to tell you, weddings are probably the most high-tension environments you can be in.
Right.
I mean, everybody's on wit's end.
Right.
Anything can go bad, and usually will when it's not supposed to. So I think if you could basically psychologically comfort the client saying, hey, I'm here, just go have fun. Go get go get married.
You're so right there. There's so many times I'm playing either therapist or comforter or something because of your experience. You can just make up a story if you have to and say, hey, look, I've been in this situation before, and they trust you because of the fact that they know that, okay, as long as my photos are great, and you just kind of say, look, this is my job to make sure that I document the great memories of your day and really kind of make it such a great day to remember, they trust you for that. So that's usually I agree with you in that regard, that it is a very high tension, high stress environment for things to go wrong for, two
And
people.
do you see that across all cultures? I mean,
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it happens all
That's
the time.
universal, it must be.
Yeah, and I actually used to think in the bigger weddings that there was a lot more stress, but it's the same amount of stress even with the smaller ones because
I understand zombie weddings are a little bit more low-key, but
the zombies may not show up.
So have you ever had to say no to somebody, say, hey, come on, we're going to go to this bar and 10 of my friends are going to be there who aren't going to be at the wedding, come with us? And you say, no, I can't do that.
Sometimes you go into those situations where you just don't feel like doing it and you're not up to it. And usually just kind of
battery's dead.
Yeah, exactly. Or just not feeling up to it.
And does that ruin things at times? Have you ever had a situation where they said, we're just like the vibe turned?
There are times when a client kind of expects you to do it and they kind of hint and you feel like, okay, fine, they're hinting, you just do it. But then after a while, you realize that which is chicken and egg, which would you go for? Would you have an unhappy client or would you just kind of, sit back and think, okay, I'm going to have better images if I go home and rest sort of thing. It's really a question of what is more important to you. But it's not, it's not a universal situation and, different clients respond differently.
Of course.
But what always helps is building a great relationship with your client before you get to
build the trust.
Yeah, build the trust and keep talking to them. Something I really try my best to do now is really keeping in touch with clients before their wedding day. Because then on the wedding day, you kind of feel like, it's not a big surprise that you're there, Because in the past, it used to be like, oh, wow, it's good to see you. Now it's like, okay, yeah, we talked about this last week. We've been talking about different things. We've been building up to certain things. What that now leads me to do is I can now ask them for a lot of crazy ideas about how I want to shoot them or what I want to do because we've been speaking about this wedding and talking about the things that we're going to be doing for the wedding. So that's always something to look forward to.
Do you advertise yourself as a travel wedding photographer, or is that just something that's come to you?
That's a very good question. The thing is, I only started to accept myself as a travel photographer only recently. The thing is, I've always traveled, even before photography. I've always been traveling. Then I found a way to put the photography and the travel together. But I didn't go out there to be a travel photographer. I just realized I traveled so much and I had pictures from so many places that I just thought, hang on, I could turn this into something else. I can make myself into a travel photographer because I do love to travel and I do love to take photos as I travel because I'm inspired by the new places that I travel to and I'm inspired by the people. One is I add that to my whole box of tricks.
How do you define destination wedding compared to travel wedding? And do you find yourself doing more of what I guess I'll call a travel wedding where the people are from that spot and you're going there? Or maybe a destination weddings where everyone is going to one location, including you?
I used to do a lot of destination initially. And then I was doing some travel to certain places. So I'll give you an example. I was traveling to Lagos, Nigeria a lot because that's where my family's from. And I was doing a lot in the UK because I moved to the US. Then I started, some sort of exposure came out somewhere where I started making some connections with people in South Africa and people in Namibia, people in Asia, or people in Europe. And so then I started traveling to those places because people discovered that, oh, this is a really good photographer, or this is some person who's actually done some really good work for a friend. It's always through a network.
Right.
And then now I'm finding that I'm now doing more travel photography for weddings than destination photography for weddings.
And how much do you shoot here in New York?
I would say about 20% of the weddings I would shoot are in New York.
Okay.
So it's mostly destination.
Yeah,
that
it's
you're doing.
mostly away, mostly travel, or mostly away. But the US is huge. You know, I would say 60% of my weddings are in the US now. 40% are outside the US. And of that 60%, the 20% of the majority are in New York. Most of the rest are in the country.
And is there any one thing that we may overlook or people would not think of in terms of something to budget when you're traveling?
When I think about it now, most of the times when we do travel, we only think about the wedding and where we're going to stay. We never think about the stuff in between. And I think it's always worth budgeting things like traveling around, paying someone just to get past things, just to do, like, you can, the bad word is bribery, but, you know, in that country, it's a hand. It's a way to actually get things done and to get things done quicker. Those are things I would say you should always have. And then also have like some emergency cash just in case you lose your passport or something, you know, goes amiss. If you need to hire another photographer because you've underestimated the sheer size of the event, or you're working for a client who wants photographs of every single guest at every single moment. I think
You just buy the security tapes from the facility. It's easy. You just pull frames.
I just steal the photo booth camera. You know, I mean, I think those are the things that we take for granted because we always look at a wedding from our own sort of environmental perspective. Until we actually get there, things are always very different. And it's easy to think, oh, I'm going to shoot it exactly as I've seen it. I've had to take with me a bodyguard, not so much because it was dangerous, but I just needed someone to kind of create the room and the way for me so that I could take my photos.
And do you charge? I know we're gonna break soon, but do you charge for your own meals when you're not the day of the wedding, but the days prior and the days after? Travel, taxis, meals, all that kind of stuff is something that you budget in and it covers in your flat fee, or do you just kind of look at that as separate?
For meals outside the wedding, I would probably put that in my own buck. And I would probably budget that as part of the costs of going there. So but most clients wouldn't be they don't expect you to do that, to kind of charge them for meals, unless the client is taking care of you, where you're living in their house, which has happened a few times, where they give you a room in the house and they're taking care of your meals.
Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we come back. We're going to talk a little bit more with Jide about the style of his work and the way he approaches his subjects. Stay tuned.
We hope you're enjoying this edition of the B&H Photography Podcast. Send us a tweet at BHPhotoVideo, #BHPhotoPodcast.
We are back. Before we start talking about your particular style and the way you approach your subjects, is it safe to assume that if somebody is already calling you and they're willing to hire you and put you on a plane and fly you to some other place on the planet, I would assume that it's because they want your eyes?
Well, I'm just a really good salesman, but
The bait and switch.
no. But the point, I think you're right. I think if they have seen or at least followed certain things that you're doing, or at least I'm doing, they would want me to do something to that effect. I think sometimes when a bride is getting married, she obviously, most of the times with most brides I've met, they've been planning their weddings since they were like 10 years old. And they have a vision of what they're looking for. Then they see someone who does something close to what they're looking for and they want them to do that. But again, remember I said it's close to it. It's not exactly what they're looking for. So they bring out the Pinterest photos and say, hey, by the way, I know you're a very skilled person and I love what you do. However, can we also do some of this stuff because this would also mean something to me? More often than not, I will do it for them because, I want them to realize their dreams. I want them to, be happy about that. it's not something I may present to the world. I don't really care if they do. If it's something that I'm going to learn something from, because I'm like, hey, I'm going to shoot the bride and the groom jumping off a cliff or something, which is not something I would normally do, but it's something they've always dreamt of doing, then
I would have that in my contract, actually.
Right.
Yeah. No, you must jump off a cliff.
You must jump off a cliff.
It's my signature picture.
But I have had the odd client who has come to me and said, hey, I want you to shoot my wedding, and told me this is exactly how they want me to shoot the wedding. Now I have I put active measures to make sure I can kind of filter out what it is that they want. And what I want as well. Because
what are some of those? I mean, can you explain?
Someone said to me, I don't know if this is
Like
going to be
just
taken
verbal cues and things that they say?
No,
or-
it's just certain things about themselves.
Yeah.
Someone said to me that, Jide, a bride who is, and I don't want this taken the wrong way, but someone who's very insecure about themselves will probably not work very well with you.
Yeah.
Because I really want to get close and bring things out of them that is really about them. And that doesn't mean about being highly expressive, but it's really just being who they really are. And in order for me to do that, I need to spend a lot of time with that person, especially in times when they're most vulnerable. And so there's a certain level of trust that needs to be developed so that I can then now bring out that thing that they may be insecure about, but then capture it in a beautiful way. So a lot of the times I photograph people when they're most vulnerable and created images that to them, they're like, I remember last week, someone actually said to me, I don't like taking photos. I don't want you to take too many portraits of me and just photograph the wedding. You know, let me see the wedding from my perspective. I don't want to see the wedding from the guest perspectives. And I said, okay, fine. But then I was just prompted by a really interesting composition at some point. I said, can you just give me some time to do this? He's like, Jide, I told you, I don't want to take so many portraits. I was like, just trust me for this particular moment. So I put them in this really interesting light, did the photo, showed it to them, and they're like, oh my God.
Did you show them right after?
Yeah, I did. I showed them right after. And they're like, oh my God. I didn't show them because I wanted to impress them.
Right.
I showed them just so they could see what I was doing.
Right.
And so they were like...
So that they would trust you.
And well, possibly true. I just showed them like, hey, this is what I got almost. And then they came back and go, oh, wow. Wow, that is amazing. I've never, ever been photographed like that. And then I kept on taking more photos and I showed them like, oh, wow. Then I remember them sending me an email a few days after saying, I have now been inspired to take more pictures of myself because, you know, all of a sudden now I've seen myself in a different perspective. And I think what had happened was there was a certain kind of trust that they had started to regain again. And that certain insecurity they had within themselves was kind of quieting down. Whatever magic spell that may have, been cast over them. But, and I think that was also a testament to myself. Like, sometimes you just have to trust your own instincts and just kind of go for something. Obviously, don't try to push too hard, but really kind of develop that trust. If it doesn't work out, then maybe it's just not your day. But sometimes it can, the sun can shine on you and...
You have to take a shot at it.
Right.
The worst they can do is say no.
Right.
Yeah. Well, let me back up a little bit to talk about the style that I've seen, at least on your website and from the work I know. You could call it a documentary style, but there's so much love in a lot of these photos and there's humor and I don't think I've seen a wedding photographer where there's so many just nice, genuine smiles that you're getting, not forced, not posed, anything like that. And the one thing that I liked specifically, and I imagine you get a little bit of pushback maybe from brides and mother-in-laws, is that you tend to put the bride in the corner of the frame or on the side of the frame. So you get the environment that they're in, and you get a feel. Was that a style that you developed over time, or did that you incorporated your documentary work into that? And what kind of feedback do you get from people?
So I guess what you're talking about is kind of really, there's a lot of negative space, but then also a great emphasis on the actual environment.
Yeah.
So I think what it is that in terms of composition and in space, I really, really want the space to play a big part in the story and in what's actually being presented.
It's environmental portraiture.
It's very, very much so. Yeah, totally. But at the same time, I also want expression to come out. So there's also action going on in the portraits. Because again, I also want to show the variation of the places that I'm working in. because if that way I don't have to focus too much on the aesthetics of posing the person or little things that your eyes will be drawn to when they're a lot closer. With that being said, when it comes to, like you mentioned, there's a lot of love or a lot of happiness, a lot of joy, and a lot of expression. The culture I come from is very expressive. People tend to like to express themselves, be it in their emotions or even in their style. So I would focus on those things to really bring those things out. In an attempt to stand out, I would look for ways that they would truly express themselves, maybe through music. So in terms of creating portraiture, I would often have, say, a Bluetooth speaker with me, playing music that they like. And then having them sort of respond to that would be things that would create moments that I would capture based around their own responses or reactions to that music.
So you're baiting him with music. I like that.
Completely, totally.
You also mentioned just earlier, jumping back, about getting into some private or vulnerable spaces with people. Do you always go upfront about that? Say, listen, I want to be there when you're, trying on the dress or doing such and such, and do they say no sometimes, and you push back, and where's that give and take?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Or where do these vulnerable moments happen?
Yeah, that's okay. So that's a really, really, really good question, and I think I'm still trying to work out for myself, the best way to get around that. I do like being in those spaces, and I think it's an honor and a privilege to be allowed into those spaces, particularly when you're working with very conservative people who aren't used to having people with a camera in their most vulnerable places. And usually what generally tends to happen is I wouldn't make it obvious to them that I want to be there. I mean, I would speak to them about it and say, hey, do you know what? Do you mind if I just take photos of you getting ready? Please trust me. I'm not going to expose anything that you wouldn't like. And if there's any time when I'm taking these photos you don't feel comfortable, just let me know. I can just walk out or just give you some time. Or if you're doing a prayer or something like that, and, I would like to, just be around you. If you want me to just sit down with you and just talk to you or something, I would do so. Just ignore the camera or just know that I'm going to take some
Put
photos.
on the therapist hat.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the people I work with do not like expressing their very vulnerable side. They're very, very conscious of that. They don't want to be presented in that way. If they're used to being presented as a sort of strong, go-getting, fierce individual, and then you have this photo of them crying, more often than not, they would ask you to leave the room. But yeah, there are times when I'm photographing a bride and she gets into tears, and bridesmaid says, "Jide, you need to get out. You need to get out." And another bridesmaid says, "No, he needs to capture this. He needs to capture this." And then there's this dialogue going on between them, and it's so important for me to not just sort of. It's interesting because then I realize that, oh my God, there's a really big story here. Not only is she crying, they're arguing about the fact that I'm in the room, So I'm going to
Snapping away.
Yeah. There's a really interesting photo on my website where the bride gets into her dress. She sees herself in the mirror and she starts to bawl out. And then her auntie is helping her on the dress. She's like, "Don't you cry. Stop crying." She's wagging her finger at her and kind of really trying to express to her that you can't show any weakness on this day. Yeah, I know that it's sad that your mum isn't around to see you in your dress, because that's what brought the tears out. Her mum was deceased and all, and so she's always wanted her mum to be there. But it was just interesting seeing the reaction of people around and them in that regard. And then of course she now looks at me and goes, she's wagging her hands across her neck to kind of tell me, you shouldn't take these pictures. You shouldn't take these pictures. This is not what she wants to remember. But it's, at the end of the day, I remember showing it to her and she's like, yeah, that photo really meant something to her, because
they could always discard them. But if you don't have it,
exactly.
Your job is to capture everything that's there.
Precisely.
And then throw away the other stuff afterwards, edit down later.
I noticed one photo of yours, or maybe a couple, but one where the bride and groom were separate from each other, but they're giving a look, to each other across even an empty space. Or do you set that up often to do that, or is that just something you happen to catch?
So whenever I pose a couple, I have I think 3 or 4 poses that I use. Most of I think the 3 of them involve holding them and holding themselves, and then there's what I call the separation portraits, where I kind of use them as just figures in the space, and then because I really like the idea of connection, I would sort of instruct a look. Again, I like bringing out a reaction out of people. I like to kind of show like something that they will remember, that is some sort of moment, something that brings some sort of feeling. Whenever I do talks, I tell people that, whilst the dictionaries talk about moments as a period in time, but they never address the aspect of feeling, because moments really also have to do with feeling, and pictures really bring out the feeling aspect of moments. When you look at all the pictures, that particularly iconic photos, what's kind of made them really iconic is the feeling you can get from that moment that has been captured.
Yeah.
Cool.
A lot of your stuff is visually very, very street-ish.
Yes.
A lot of odd, hard angles, and just a lot of playing visually.
Right.
And do you find yourself in the midst of things all of a sudden get into this headspace where you're just a photographer taking cool pictures, and it happens to be at a wedding? Do you find yourself like go away every once in a while?
Forget that it's a wedding. I
Yeah.
guess, yeah.
I think that has a lot to do with what inspires me. When I look at photographers who inspire me, people like James Narchway or Alex Webb or Steve McCurry, actually, I see certain moments in a wedding that look like their photos. And I'm thinking, that looks like a moment that I've seen in one of Narchway's photos. There's this particular composition. Let me try and capture or create something similar. Or one that, look, I've seen the interesting use of light that Alex Webb may have used with an interesting composition. I'm going to try and do that sort of thing. So different moments in the wedding, I would kind of focus my eyes on that moment. I just recently witnessed a conference where a speaker actually really said something really interesting about inspiration. Have you ever thought about being inspired by yourself? And I thought, what do you mean by being inspired by yourself? It's like, think about it. What if you're inspired by yourself, but yourself of 20 years ahead of you? And I thought, I never really thought about that. It's like, yeah, now think about the pictures that you may be taking then and focus on that. So sometimes I think about, what kind of photos do I want to take sort of in the next 20 years and try and make those photos, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
It does, sure.
So sometimes in the wedding, I would abstractly come up with some wacky ideas and like, what would be so cool if we had like, some LEDs from like some church across the street on here that was kind of lined up on the altar or something, and it was so retro. Would it be so cool if we had that? How would I create a photo in that regard? Can we put LEDs on the altar? Can we do those sort of things?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I come up with stupid ideas like that. Never usually works, but
You want to try that?
but at least it's some attempt to kind of really stretch my imagination in terms of creating my own particular look and saying this actually came from my own inspiration of somebody who I created 20 years from now.
How many weddings do you do a year?
At the moment, I've limited it to
summer?
about 25.
Okay.
I used to do a lot more, but because of all the traveling, it started to take its toll on you. I'm not a spring chicken anymore, so.
I just want to mention one thing though earlier. Just while there are many photos where the bride and the groom are separate or in the corner of the frame, and you're seeing the space around, there are many intimate up close photos and like these kind of gorgeous moments of emotion on the bride's face, caught up close.
A lot of good
I mean,
storytelling going on.
What
there.
I haven't seen is a lot of photos, and probably it's because the way you edit your website is, the kind of typical photo of the bride and groom with the minister in front of them and their hands and the kiss. I'm assuming you do all of that as well, or do you kind of say, listen, I'll leave that for my assistant?
As far as shooting a wedding is concerned, most wedding photographers do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, you want to attract the couples or the people who are inspired by your photos. So I generally present the photos that I think people who I want to see. So I guess it's easy for me to say, yeah, I can show the photo of the minister kind of, with the bride and groom kind of doing their own thing. I think that's kind of almost assumed. Mm-hmm. Most of the times I think the common theme that I hear whenever I meet a bride is when I ask her, what are you looking for? They always say, I'm looking for something different. They never really define what that word means. But I've now come to realize that word different means something that I've not seen, something that's not traditional, something that's a bit, different from what I have seen. And then I show them, say, a photograph taken from the back of the minister when they're doing their first kiss, and they're like, now that's different. You know, why? Because it's not the typical shot that was taken from the front. It's showing me a different perspective from a wedding that I, you know, in the way I haven't seen. So my goal is to present a wedding in a different way from they would normally see it. So I seek those angles that are slightly different. So most of my shots will probably be taken from underneath people's shoes or from above their heads and things like that, but hardly from the same angle from the usual
Will you also take, just to keep yourself covered, you know, all of the usual boring pictures?
Yes. Oh, yeah,
And the reason I'm thinking about that is because, again, it's a wedding. It's not like you say, you know what, we forgot, next time we'll catch those shots. There is no next time.
No, of course not.
It's a one-shot event. Will you also cover yourself shooting those stiff pictures?
Which is why we always have two shooters.
Okay.
So one person is always doing, and I sell this to clients because they ask me, why should I have two photographers? And I tell them, well, it's not only can I be in two places at the same time, but I also have I can take what we call creative risk, i.e. myself or the second shooter could go and do the creative shot. I would do the safe shot or vice versa. Mm-hmm. And that way we're able to present the wedding in the way that we've promised you that we can. Mm-hmm. But if I'm shooting a wedding by myself, I can't take that risk anymore because, yes, you may want those photos to look that way, but grandma may not like those photos and your husband may not like those photos, or so-and-so may want something very traditional. Mm-hmm. And, you know, at the end of the day, we all kind of, when we think about it, when we do go to all our houses, no matter how creative we are, the photo that we end up putting on the mantelpiece or on the wall is always
the
most...
corpses lined up. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Now, you said you've done weddings with up to 5,000 people. Have you?
Yes.
Now,
quite a few times.
Just please tell me that they did not request table pictures.
I have had one that did.
Really?
But that was because they did not want to hire other photographers. So remember I said that usually in those weddings they have...
the mob shows up.
Exactly. Yeah. So this wedding, they said they didn't want any of that. They wanted complete order and control. So what they expected me to do was to hire the mob, if that makes sense, and then control the mob. So in that situation, what will happen is I would outsource certain parts of the wedding coverage to certain other photography companies, and then they would work through me to deliver the photos.
Okay. You're busy at those times.
It's pretty. You're more.
It's pretty hairy.
You're more a director than an actual photographer in that situation.
Sure.
Yeah.
When you have a second shooter, I think you work with the same person a lot, but do you often try to hire a woman so that you can get into those moments that maybe you couldn't otherwise, or is that an issue that's come up?
It has come up quite a few times, especially when you're photographing weddings in the East. So, say in an Islamic wedding, or they call them nikahs, a man can't be in the room when the woman is changing. So, or even during bridal preps. Sometimes I've been in situations where the bride is quite liberal and said, I don't really care, I want you in here. But most of the times when that happens, I would have to hire a female photographer to do all that. And most of the times, even the men and women do not mix in the ceremonies and things like that. So you always need to have someone who's of that faith sometimes, or someone who understands what needs to be done. So yeah, that's happened quite a few times.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Good. I think we found the title of this podcast, the multicultural wedding photographer. But that's a really interesting point. When the sexes can't blend together like that, you got some challenges. Right?
It is quite challenging. It can be quite annoying because, you know, a moment gets captured that's not yours, and I can't take credit for it.
Yeah.
And you want to. I mean, I've some of my Eastern wedding photographers counterparts. They have captured some really amazing photos that I wish I could capture because of, again, those restrictions. You're not able to do those sort of things. So it sometimes eats into you that you can't do this sort of thing. But then again, they can't do the same with the guys, because they look at you and they look at you in the same vein. I wish I could be in the same position that you're in with the guys to take photographs there, but they can't come into those spaces, at least not by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Terrific talking with you today. If people want to see your work and see what we've been talking about, where should they go?
So most of my work is presented on my website, alakija.com, Alakija. And then I also use Instagram very regularly. So it's Alakija again on Instagram, or Alakija Studios. I think I have two. Yeah, I definitely do know I have two Instagram pages that I update.
Alakija and Alakija Studios.
Yes.
Yeah, strongly recommend taking a visit over. His work is terrific.
Thank you.
Okay.
Love it.
And before we sign off, just a reminder, we do have a homepage now for the B&H Photography Podcast, and you can read articles, see photographs by the people we are interviewing, and all kinds of interesting stuff. And of course, you have all of our existing episodes. On behalf of John Harris and Jason Tables and myself, thank you so much for tuning in today.